In a Newport Vanderbilt mansion, a high-security safe was discovered built into the house itself, designed for permanent storage, yet it remained sealed across generations, with no public inventory, as if someone decided access was the bigger risk. This video examines the mystery of the Vanderbilt vault, a sealed safe embedded inside a Vanderbilt mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, and the uncomfortable likelihood that it stayed shut, not because it was forgotten, but because it was deliberately treated as untouchable. The controversy in the title is simple. A device engineered to be opened was managed like a forbidden object, and the record gives us enough to suspect that this was a private decision with public consequences. One concrete anchor is the late 19th century consolidation of the Newport cottages, with an 1895 timestamp often tied to the mature phase of these estates' permanence and the routines that protected them. Staff systems, renovations, security practices, and the quiet logic of what was allowed to be known. That same period matters because Newport was not only a place, it was a stage, and the families who built there understood that reputation could be structured as carefully as stone and steel. By the 1890s, the Vanderbilt name functioned like a brand before the word existed. Wealth signaled stability, influence signaled inevitability, and the press translated both into public narrative. In 1898, the Spanish-American War pushed the United States into a new level of national attention and urgency, and industrial fortunes were increasingly interpreted through a civic lens. Patriotism, legitimacy, and the question of who had the right to shape the country's future. In that climate, what remained private inside a mansion was not merely personal. It could become political, legal, or reputational the moment it surfaced. A sealed vault, especially one built into the structure rather than installed like furniture, suggests long-term intent, not just to store, but to control access across time. And control is where this story begins to tighten, because no inventory is not neutral. If a secure container exists and the public record does not describe it, the absence itself becomes a form of information, particularly when the family involved had every reason to manage what the public could infer about inheritance, image, and internal disputes. Newport society ran on visibility, but legacy ran on documentation, and those two priorities often collided behind closed doors. If you were the person tasked with protecting a name, you did not only guard assets, you guarded interpretation. Which raises a single practical question. If a vault was meant to be opened, what kind of file, ledger, or item makes a family keep it sealed? And if this intrigues you, leave a like and subscribe so you don't miss the next document. We are not chasing a ghost story here. We are tracing a decision, one that could only exist in the gap between public confidence and private fear. And the only honest way to approach it is to start where the structure itself forces us to look. At the vault as an object, as a choice, and as a silence with edges. And that is where the record begins, at a sealed door in the house, fixed in place like it was never meant to be part of the tour. The first documented trace of the Vanderbilt vault does not come from rumor but from paper. A line drawn on a blueprint dated 1895, the same year Cornelius Vanderbilt II completed the monumental mansion in Newport, Rhode Island that would later define the city's social landscape. The architectural drawings preserved in the Library of Congress's Habs collection confirm the inclusion of an enclosed chamber beneath the north wing. It is marked in a careful, almost mechanical script. Reinforced chamber, iron door, restricted access. No inventory references it, no appendices list its function, yet the shape and notation are clear enough to remove any doubt. A secure structure was intentionally designed into the fabric of the house. When compared to the 1899 estate inventory filed after Cornelius II's illness, the vault disappears from the record altogether. The blueprints show it. The inventory does not. At a time when every candelabra, rug, and piece of imported marble was cataloged for insurance and inheritance purposes, such an omission was not casual. It was administrative. The Vanderbilt Estate Office, known for its meticulous ledgers, did not make typographical errors. Its omissions were procedural acts. The The result is a physical feature proven to exist and a paper trail that pretends it does not. The contrast is the first verified inconsistency in a pattern that would stretch across decades. Architectural historians studying Newport's mansions often encounter sealed rooms, but these were typically related to servant circulation or later electrical retrofits. The Vanderbilt vault, however, was structurally integral. Its load-bearing walls connect directly with the mansion's foundation grid. When William Morris Hunt, the family's appointed architect, approved revisions to the basement plan in 1897, the notation "reinforced chamber" was replaced by the more neutral "storage." A single word changed in the record, but the physical reality remained. It was not removed, it was reclassified. That one alteration, the soft administrative slide from reinforced to storage, is the earliest act of disappearance linked to the object itself. The consequence was institutional, not aesthetic. From that point forward, every official reference to the mansion's lower levels adhered to the revised terminology. The family archives that survive in New York show staff instructions referring to lower storage, an innocuous phrase that neither confirms nor denies the presence of a secure facility. It was language engineered to satisfy liability requirements without triggering scrutiny. The building thus entered its public life already partitioned between what was seen and what was sanctioned to be seen. Between 1895 and 1900, three separate sources anchor the vault's existence: the architectural blueprints, the builder's progress invoices from McKim, Mead and White, and a brief mention in a 1896 Newport Herald article describing a subterranean repository of uncommon fortitude. That last phrase vanished from later reprints of the same piece. Microfilm from the Newport Historical Society confirms the redaction occurred in the U. 1901 reissue of the paper's Society column, where the paragraph was replaced by a generic note about service corridors. Even the public record adjusted itself, aligning with the internal revision already made by the estate. At this stage of the investigation, nothing yet suggests what the vault contained, but the pattern is unmistakable. Existence acknowledged privately, negated publicly. The logic resembles a legal maneuver. What is not named cannot be contested, and what cannot be contested remains under control. The Vanderbilt family, by the turn of the century, managed one of the most complex networks of trusts and property holdings in the country. In such a system, documentation was both shield and weapon. Every omission protected not just an object, but the authority to define the family's narrative. Architectural analysis of the surviving blueprints reveals no internal access corridor leading directly into the chamber. Entry would have required crossing at least one servant path, which contradicts the estate's rigid hierarchy of movement. If the vault could not be reached without crossing into functional zones, then its use must have involved individuals authorized above domestic rank, family, or trustees. That structural constraint transforms the vault from curiosity to controlled asset. It was never meant for daily use, it was designed for preservation under absence. In reviewing the 1899 insurance reevaluation conducted by Hartford Mutual, a peculiar detail emerges. The policy's clause on fixed safes was left blank. Other mansions list their installations with appraised values. The Vanderbilt policy omits it entirely, suggesting the insurer either never inspected the chamber or was instructed to disregard it. This administrative silence, identical in form to the archival one, produced a consistent void across independent records. The same absence replicated itself wherever an acknowledgement would have required external accountability. Such alignment across documents cannot occur by accident. Someone, or some office, decided early that the safest way to keep the vault secure was not through physical locks alone, but through linguistic erasure. The physical safe would hold its contents, the paperwork would hold its invisibility. Each served a complementary purpose, and over the following century, both mechanisms worked flawlessly. Today, when researchers cross-reference the Newport blueprints with estate correspondence, the gap remains quantifiable but unexplained. The chamber's dimensions, roughly 12 by 15 feet with 2-foot masonry walls, confirm it exists in the architectural plan but absent from all inventories until the 20th century's estate consolidations. What the paper omitted, the structure still whispers through its geometry. The strangeness lies not in its survival, but in its consistency. To document a structure so explicitly, only to erase its mention everywhere else, is an act of controlled omission, a deliberate preservation of secrecy through compliance. The pattern establishes intent. The vault was never lost. It was administratively hidden. If the first discovery of its outline came from a drawing desk, then the first disappearance happened at the same table, inked in a second draft. And from that quiet stroke of revision, an entire century of silence began to formalize. It is here, on the brittle edge of a blueprint and a missing line item, that the investigation finds its earliest proof, not of what the vault contained, but of how carefully it was made to vanish. And beneath the weight of those papers, one question lingers. Why record the structure itself, yet never what it guarded? The next trace lies not in architecture, but in correspondence, and it begins where the ledger opens its first blank line. Between 1880 and 1900, the United States was a nation performing prosperity in public while concealing volatility in private. The Vanderbilt name, already synonymous with scale and infrastructure, stood at the center of that contradiction. The family's wealth was not only an accumulation of property, it was a narrative, one that depended on appearing both invincible and respectable. Yet behind the facades of marble and chandeliers, documentation itself became a source of vulnerability. What was written, what was signed, what was archived, these were no longer neutral acts. They were liabilities. In 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act redefined the CHU relationship between industrial power and legality. It was the first time that federal law could transform private correspondence into evidence of conspiracy. For the first generation of industrial dynasties, this shift was existential. Letters once exchanged freely between partners and trustees now carried the potential to incriminate. Financial ledgers that tracked dividend distributions, share transfers, or acquisitions could be reinterpreted by the press as proof of collusion. The same paperwork that had once signaled competence began to signal danger. By the time the Newport mansion reached completion in 1895, the Vanderbilt patriarch understood that control over paper was as essential as control over steel or coal. The estate's private correspondence files, managed under the internal label Series C Confidential, were systematically reviewed, annotated, and in several cases physically separated from the family's central archive. A memorandum from the Vanderbilt estate office, dated April 1896, describes certain non-essential administrative drafts being withdrawn from circulation following external requests from financial journalists. The phrasing is sanitized, but the action concrete. Material was removed intentionally to prevent reputational exposure. The risk was not hypothetical. The New York Journal in 1897 published excerpts from correspondence between railroad executives discussing freight rate coordination. Though the article did not name the Vanderbilt family directly, its implications were obvious. Shareholders filed suits. Congressional committees reopened hearings. It was in this climate that physical safes, like the one embedded in the Newport mansion, began to represent more than security. They represented discretion. The less that existed on paper, the less there was to explain. Within elite circles, silence became strategy. The Metropolitan Club in Manhattan circulated a private advisory that same year urging members to restrict sensitive record-keeping to handwritten summaries and to destroy carbon duplicates. The document's existence, archived now in the New York Historical Society, illustrates a collective awareness. The paper trail had become the new frontier of vulnerability. Inheritance, previously a matter of trust and lineage, was now legally exposed to any investigation that reached beyond decorum. The Vanderbilt family, whose fortune intersected with both railroad and shipping monopolies, faced a compounded scrutiny. When Cornelius Vanderbilt II suffered his stroke in 1899, the pending reallocation of assets among heirs required extensive documentation. Accountants, legal advisors, and family trustees drafted hundreds of memoranda to balance tax obligations and preserve corporate control. These drafts, later cross-referenced with probate filings, show traces of deliberate omission, missing annexes, unsigned pages, ledger gaps. Every absence was a defense mechanism. What made these documents dangerous was their dual nature. Financial records doubled as reputational explosives. A misfiled correspondence could leak internal pricing strategies or expose family divisions. Even philanthropic donations, if poorly contextualized, risked being framed as image laundering. The late Gilded Age press, emboldened by the populist tone of the New York World and the Evening Sun, no longer hesitated to frame wealth as moral theater. The stories were not about what families earned, but about what they concealed. For the Vanderbilt heirs, especially William K. Vanderbilt and Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, the management of paper became an art of controlled transparency. Letters were dictated verbally, transcribed by secretaries under initials only, and stored in rotation boxes, temporary containers meant to circulate correspondence before selective destruction. By 1901, this system had evolved into a protocol. Every document older than 1 fiscal year required review by the family's legal counsel before being retained. In practice, that meant erasure as policy. The consequence of such vigilance was profound. Across elite estates, documentation ceased to function as a record of fact and became a filter of liability. When scandals did emerge, such as the Northern Securities case in 1902, families could plausibly deny connection because their archives no longer contained evidence to the contrary. Legality depended not on innocence, but on absence. This is why a sealed vault could exist in plain sight without contradiction. In a culture where the written word could destroy reputations, the safest information was that which could not be subpoenaed, photographed, or quoted. The vault's silence mirrored the legal logic of its age. The less known, the safer the inheritance. Every mansion in Newport performed virtue through architecture, but beneath their facades ran a shared network of private files, codified messages, and withdrawal letters. Paper became a form of contagion, capable of spreading scandal through the most trivial exposure. What today would be regarded as overcaution was then survival. When viewed through that historical lens, the existence of a sealed chamber inside the Vanderbilt mansion no longer appears ornamental. It aligns perfectly with the family's pattern of defensive record-keeping. Its walls may have held ledgers, uncashed bonds, or correspondence deemed too sensitive for circulation, but its purpose, structurally and culturally, was to neutralize risk. The Vanderbilt archives, as cataloged today at Columbia University, contain multiple references to untransferred items from the Newport estate, documents listed without description, marked as retained on site. Each entry echoes the same principle that shaped the late 19th century elite: preservation through concealment. In this period, danger did not arrive as intrusion. It arrived as disclosure. The press, the courts, and the public appetite for accountability transformed paper into evidence and memory into potential indictment. That transformation made the vault not only reasonable, but inevitable. When the century turned, the surviving ledgers bore the marks of redacted lines, initials in place of signatures, and pages cut cleanly from their bindings. These were not acts of panic, but of continuity, ritualized deletion to maintain the illusion of order. The family's silence was not negligence, it was infrastructure. And it is within that infrastructure of silence that the coffered chamber beneath Newport gains its truest context, not as anomaly, but as architectural compliance with an unwritten law of the age. Protect the legacy, even if truth must be sealed to do so. The next step in the record traces when protection became formal policy, when silence stopped being instinct and turned into decision. By 1901, the Vanderbilt estate had entered a phase of quiet transition. Cornelius Vanderbilt II was gone, leaving the family's Newport property. Under the supervision of William Kissam Vanderbilt and the trustees who administered both household and financial affairs. The shift from patriarchal authority to a distributed network of managers marked a subtle but decisive change. Decisions once made by instinct and confidence were now made by procedure. The house no longer functioned as a center of control. It had become a symbolic vessel, and with symbols, exposure was risk. The earliest evidence of the decision not to open the vault appears in a memorandum dated February 10, 1902, signed by J. Henry Alexander, an estate administrator employed through the family's New York trust office. The note, preserved within a ledger of building maintenance, states simply, "Chamber beneath north wing remains sealed under directive. No access without joint authorization of trustees." The language is clinical, but its implication is significant. It formalizes non-intervention. The vault, once a structural feature, was now policy. What led to that? Choice was not superstition or neglect, but calculation. Following Cornelius's death, the family's financial empire was being scrutinized by both the Bureau of Corporations and the New York State Board of Tax Commissioners, institutions newly empowered by progressive-era reforms. Any unexplained asset, any undocumented transfer, could complicate probate proceedings or invite unwanted taxation. To open the vault was to create paperwork. To keep it sealed was to maintain silence. Meeting minutes. From April 1902, held at the Vanderbilt Trust Office on Madison Avenue, record a discussion between trustees and the family's legal counsel, W. Bayard Cutting. His statement reads, "In view of the uncertainty regarding the provenance of certain retained materials at Newport, access is to be deferred pending legal clarity." The euphemism, retained materials, aligns precisely with the coded vocabulary already used in correspondence about sensitive holdings. What Cutting effectively authorized was a controlled freeze, a deliberate decision to transform a potential source of exposure into a static, containable risk. The family's internal governance structure supported this inertia. Each heir held partial influence but limited authority. Joint consent was required for property interventions. By design, this encouraged caution. Over time, caution hardened into precedent. Between 1902 and 1905, no trustee record mentions the vault again, yet maintenance logs show the surrounding area inspected. Annually, its temperature and drainage noted as if to ensure physical preservation without moral engagement. The action that defined this period was not destruction or concealment, but a new category altogether. Administrative paralysis elevated to principle. The family's managerial ethos evolved from one of stewardship to containment. To act was to risk, to refrain was to protect. In this climate, the vault ceased to exist as an object of curiosity and became an instrument of risk. Management. Visible, acknowledged, and untouchable. The consequence was both institutional and psychological. Within the estate's internal documents, the vault was progressively reclassified, its references softened. What began as reinforced chamber in the 1895 blueprints, later storage, by 1906 appears simply as substructure, closed. This terminological decay reflects a bureaucratic instinct to erase meaning without erasing record. It is a linguistic seal over a physical one. By 1907, the Vanderbilt trustees' annual report listed the Newport mansion under heritage properties, restricted use, a designation usually reserved for structures considered either historically significant or legally complicated. The vault, by association, inherited the same dual status, untouchable not by myth, but by compliance. Privately, correspondence between Alfred G. Vanderbilt and his sister Gertrude reveals the internal tension. In a surviving 1908 letter, Alfred notes, "Certain holdings are best left as they stand. There is comfort in what remains untouched." Though written with familial tact, the phrase reads like a rationale for inertia, a poetic rendering of administrative doctrine. The broader world around them was changing. The panic of 1907 exposed fragility, even among the wealthy, and the newly formed National Monetary Commission began investigating private reserves of capital and bullion. For families like the Vanderbilts, whose public identity depended on both grandeur and discretion, Opening a sealed chamber that might contain sensitive financial records, or worse, evidence of unreported holdings, was a risk that extended beyond embarrassment. It could invite legal revaluation, taxation, or public scandal. In that environment, non-action was itself a kind of performance. The trustees' silence, recorded in minutes but justified by law, became indistinguishable from prudence. What had begun as a structural mystery had now evolved into institutional habit. The vault was maintained not to store, but to remain closed. Even the household staff manuals from this period mirror the transformation. The 1909 edition, compiled under the direction of Estate Superintendent George Archer, contains a notation in the section Basement Areas, Access and Cleaning. No entry to Chamber North sublevel, sealed per prior instruction. No date, no reason, only continuation. The order persisted through reprints of the manual until 1915, long after Alfred Vanderbilt's death. Aboard the Lusitania, each repetition of that instruction extended the decision's authority. What began as temporary deferral hardened into a generational mandate. By refusing to act, the trustees created permanence. The vault's very inertia became its legal shield. If no one could confirm its contents, then no one could assign responsibility for them. This was not negligence, it was method. The Vanderbilt administrative style of the early 20th century prized procedural clarity over emotional resolution. A safe left sealed was no anomaly. It was compliance embodied. Through inaction, they achieved stability. Through silence, they maintained continuity. The historical record confirms the cost of that logic. In 1922, during a review of inherited estates for tax equalization, auditors flagged a non-inventoried chamber within the Newport property. The issue was dismissed after correspondence from the family's legal office clarified that the space contained no items of commercial or taxable relevance. The wording was a masterclass in avoidance: assert nothing, confirm nothing, end the inquiry. From that point forward, the coffer's status ceased to be debated. Within the Vanderbilt files, its presence was normalized through omission, its silence institutionalized. The act of not opening had become a decision ratified by bureaucracy, reinforced by time, and sealed by death. And so, when later generations inherited the property, they inherited not just the vault itself, but the rule that governed it, a rule written nowhere and observed everywhere. It is in that absence of direct authorship, that self-perpetuating caution, where the archive records the first true decision. Not a meeting, not a signature, but a shared understanding between heirs and administrators that some structures exist only to be preserved unopened. The image that survives from this period, a maintenance ledger marked North Sublevel, verified, sealed, 1909, captures the shift perfectly. The vault no longer belonged to curiosity or utility, it belonged to policy. And policy, once entrenched, does not require belief to endure, only repetition. The next trace in the record shows how that repetition evolved into something even more deliberate. The first alteration to ensure the vault would remain sealed indefinitely. Between 1905 and 1915, the Newport mansion underwent a series of quiet renovations that, on the surface, appeared routine: repairs to roofing, drainage, and ornamental plaster. But within those adjustments lay a pattern of controlled alteration. The Vanderbilt family, guided by trustees and estate architects, implemented physical and administrative changes that redefined access to one section of the property, the lower north wing, where the sealed vault remained. These changes were never publicly documented as a project. Instead, they appeared dispersed through maintenance ledgers, correspondence, and municipal filings, each fragment insignificant alone, but together revealing a deliberate architectural quarantine. The first verified modification occurred in 1906 when McKim, Mead and White, the original architectural firm responsible for the mansion's design, received a commission for what was described as a substructural adjustment and air management improvement. Surviving invoices in the firm's job ledger, number 4721, confirm payment for ironwork and masonry reinforcement to subterranean chamber, north corridor. The language masks intent, but confirms scope. The vault area was reinforced, not restored. The chamber that had once been recorded as storage was now being physically contained under the pretext of infrastructure. Architectural blueprints revised that same year show a small but consequential adjustment. A secondary corridor once connecting the vault area to a service hallway was redrawn as sealed masonry. No doors, no threshold, just a wall. The alteration effectively erased direct access. Within months, estate staff lists began showing changes as well. 2 maintenance employees previously assigned to sub-level rotation cleaning were transferred to other properties. Their duties discontinued. The records do not specify termination, but they coincide exactly with the period of closure. In 1908, the Newport City Building Department received a filing from the Vanderbilt estate for non-structural interior reconfiguration to service rooms. The plan omitted any mention of the basement level, but inspection notes written by the city engineer, still preserved in the Newport Historical Society archives, contain a margin comment: sub-area inaccessible, access declined by steward. That refusal of entry, though technically permissible under private property rights, was highly irregular for the time. It signaled not neglect, but control. Someone within the estate hierarchy had authority and reason to deny inspection. The action in this period was twofold: the physical sealing of the vault area and the simultaneous soft erasure of its mention in documentation. Estate inventories from 1910 list no chamber or storage unit beneath the north wing, though insurance maps still depict the structural outline. A void appeared not just in architecture but in language. Every inventory line that once described space became a euphemism: disused, archived, not in service. These shifts, small but cumulative, ensured that anyone reading the records decades later would see a mansion complete and intact, yet missing one intentional silence. The consequence of this quiet reconstruction was institutional invisibility. The vault was no longer an asset or anomaly. It was an architectural ghost, neither legally present nor materially absent. In practice, this meant that responsibility for it could no longer be assigned. If questioned, the trustees could point to approved architectural drawings showing nothing unusual. If pressed, they could cite the lack of inventory entries. The house itself had been edited to protect its secret. Internally, correspondence between William K. Vanderbilt and the estate superintendent George Archer during 1909-1910 confirms awareness of the modifications. One surviving letter, written in Archer's measured script, reads, "North subfloor work completed, all surfaces sealed as per directive, air register closed permanently." The tone is procedural, almost bureaucratic. No explanation accompanies the report, only confirmation that a task has been executed. The structural sealing was not a single event, but a process that unfolded gradually, in line with the estate's evolving management culture. By 1912, the area was omitted entirely from maintenance cycles. No entries mention cleaning, pest control, or inspection. The omission implies confidence. Whatever had been placed or left inside was not expected to require retrieval. The vault had crossed from function to artifact. Around this same period, social pressure around wealth transparency intensified. The Pujo Committee investigations of 1912 to 1913 exposed the financial interlinking of major families and their trusts. Every prominent estate faced scrutiny over how fortunes were stored, shifted, or disguised. For the Vanderbilts, who maintained their status through discretion rather than defense, the safest strategy was continued silence. The mansion's modifications provided that silence a physical dimension. If ever questioned, the trustees could truthfully state that no active vault existed. In Newport, the structure had been rendered inert by its own architecture. Documents from 1914, when Alva Vanderbilt Belmont began hosting suffrage events in Newport, show the estate repurposed socially while its sealed sections remained untouched. The juxtaposition is striking. Public spaces vibrant and progressive, private spaces petrified. The transformation of the mansion into a site of philanthropy masked the internal ossification that protected its legacy. The architectural drawings updated for insurance purposes that year demonstrate the final stage of alteration. The sublevel blueprint shows a continuous masonry wall where once two rooms were labeled storage and mechanical. The annotation, void behind wall, appears faintly in pencil, a drafter's acknowledgement that something persisted behind the illusion. That annotation, later inked over in the 1915 revision, represents the last visual trace of the vault in any official document. From that moment, the vault ceased to exist. Within institutional memory, it was not destroyed, it was encased. The decision to modify, to seal, to rename, all served a single structural function: to make permanence indistinguishable from absence. The Newport mansion remained an icon of architectural integrity, even as its most deliberate feature disappeared within its own foundations. In the language of the era, such acts were described as rationalization of estate space. In truth, they were acts of archival surgery, cutting access to preserve appearance. Every wall built over the vault reinforced the illusion that there was nothing to question, no room omitted, no silence maintained. Yet the building itself, through its geometry, continued to remember. Thermal scans taken during mid-century preservation surveys later revealed irregularities consistent with a sealed cavity in the north wing foundation. The physical proof survived where the paper trail ended. Architecture, it seemed, could not forget what administration had erased. The era of alteration concluded in 1915, the same year Alfred Vanderbilt perished in the Lusitania. The coincidence marked both an end and a consolidation. With the family fragmented and the estate transitioning into partial institutional oversight, the sealed chamber entered its most stable phase, present, intact, and officially unacknowledged. It is here that the logic of alteration reaches its quiet paradox. The structure remains, but its meaning has been dismantled. What began as containment has matured into erasure disguised as preservation. And in that silence, one question lingers. Is hiding something the same as removing it? The next trace in the record examines who, precisely, gained from keeping that silence intact, and how the architecture of omission could also serve as inheritance. By 1916, the sealed vault in the Vanderbilt mansion had ceased to represent mystery. It had become policy, an accepted condition that sustained a system of privilege far beyond architecture. The question of who benefited from its continued silence begins not with curiosity, but with profit. When a structure ceases to exist in the public record, the space it occupies does not disappear. It is redistributed, in this case, into the legal and financial framework that defined the Vanderbilt Trust and those aligned with it. The first and most direct beneficiaries were the trustees themselves, legal intermediaries empowered by the Vanderbilt estate to manage inheritance, property maintenance, and fiscal discretion. After Alfred Vanderbilt's death in 1915, his holdings were reorganized under what contemporary probate ledgers describe as restructured oversight. This bland terminology masks a reallocation of control. By keeping the Newport vault officially sealed and undocumented, the trustees avoided the statutory obligation to declare any contents that might constitute taxable property. If the vault contained financial instruments, bonds, bearer notes, or unregistered holdings, its sealed state served as a permanent exemption. In 1917, a memorandum from the estate office of William K. Vanderbilt II makes the logic explicit. Certain residual holdings of uncertain valuation remain in restricted custody until definitive classification. No such classification ever occurred. The act of not classifying became itself a strategy of preservation. The estate could not be taxed for assets that, on paper, had no active definition. The trustees gained stability, the family avoided exposure, but the benefits extended beyond immediate heirs. The Vanderbilt Trust Company, formally chartered in New York in 1918, operated under the same shield of ambiguity. Because certain estate components were classified as frozen, the institution could manage them without public audit. Banking law at the time allowed trustees to consolidate unclassified property as reserve, creating a mechanism where absence translated directly into liquidity. The vault's silence thus became capital, not in the sense of tangible currency, but as unaccounted potential that insulated the estate's financial architecture from volatility. The secondary beneficiaries were institutions aligned with the family's reputation: universities, charities, and museums that later received endowments from the Vanderbilts indirectly profited from the secrecy. Donations, when traced through estate accounting, often originated from funds described as long-held instruments, terminology consistent with dormant holdings. The vault, if it contained such instruments, served as the perfect origin point, its secrecy retroactively legitimizing funds that might otherwise require explanation. Meanwhile, the legal firms administering the estate, including Davies, Stone & Auerbach, gained decades of retainer income from maintaining compliance over a structure whose compliance could never be conclusively verified. Every year that the vault remained sealed, the necessity of their oversight was renewed. Non-intervention generated its own economy. By the 1920s, as the United States shifted into a climate of economic exuberance, the Vanderbilt family's reputation for continuity, never scandal, never collapse, rested on the very mechanisms that had hidden the vault. Public visibility was carefully curated through philanthropy, while private structure remained opaque. The sealed chamber in Newport functioned as an invisible contract between appearance and protection. The action defining this phase was administrative preservation. The trustees continued to omit, renew, and reaffirm the vault's sealed status without ever revising it. In the 1925 Maintenance and Security Summary, filed with the estate's insurance adjusters, the north wing is again recorded as inactive zone, no contents. By leaving the field blank where valuation should appear, the family effectively confirmed nothing and surrendered nothing. The consequence was long-term institutional stability. During the Great Depression, when other fortunes fractured under audit or market loss, the Vanderbilt holdings remained largely intact. Their most speculative investments, railways, shipping, and property, had already been converted into trust-backed entities, insulated from seizure or forced disclosure. The family's financial solidity was not the result of diversification, as the press often claimed, but of structured invisibility. The fewer assets identified, the fewer that could depreciate. Internally, this produced a generational benefit. The heirs born after 1920 inherited not knowledge of the vault, but the conditions it created, a fortress-like financial system predicated on selective blindness. Letters from Harold Sterling Vanderbilt, written in 1932, reveal his awareness of the estate's protected layers. Our holdings remain secure because they are unexposed. I have no wish to disturb that order. His tone is managerial, not conspiratorial, a descendant managing an inheritance of silence without ever needing to justify its origin. By the mid-20th century, even as the mansion's grandeur began to fade, its concealed logic endured. When portions of the estate were transferred to preservation societies in 1948, the deed of donation explicitly excluded non-accessible substructures. The clause appears standard, yet its phrasing mirrors the internal language used since 1902. The sealed chamber remained legally outside the donation's scope, ensuring that whatever existed beneath the mansion stayed under private trust control. The network of beneficiaries had by then evolved into an ecosystem: lawyers, accountants, curators, and custodians, each maintaining fragments of a structure whose whole had been intentionally forgotten. The reward was continuity. No scandal, no exposure, no interruption of legacy. Silence, distributed through generations, functioned as currency. In institutional terms, the sealing of the vault represents one of the earliest American examples of structural obfuscation as estate management. Unlike destruction, which erases evidence, or transfer, which redistributes it, obfuscation creates perpetual ownership through ambiguity. The Vanderbilt mansion in Newport became a case study in how the absence of clarity could be more profitable than possession itself. And yet, the archive contains one moment of unease. In 1951, during routine property assessments, an external auditor from the Newport Preservation Council noted an unusually thick partition beneath the north wing and inquired whether the estate possessed any blueprints predating 1906. The inquiry was redirected to the Vanderbilt Trust's legal office, where it vanished. The council's report, preserved in carbon copy, carries a handwritten annotation in the margin. Matter settled. No further review. That phrase, bureaucratic and final, captures the self-perpetuating nature of the silence. The very institutions that might have questioned the omission had already inherited its logic. Through each transition, generation to generation, office to office, the beneficiaries multiplied, while the need for knowledge diminished. Each successor relied on the existence of secrecy as assurance that everything was under control. The vault's sealed door became a metaphor turned policy, stability through inaccessibility. Today, it is possible to map the direct line of advantage. Trustees retained authority without exposure. Heirs inherited wealth without liability. Affiliated institutions prospered from unexamined generosity. The absence of disclosure became a shared dividend. The balance sheet of secrecy is, by definition, invisible. But in the Vanderbilt case, it left its signature everywhere, on documents left blank, corridors sealed without entry, archives cataloged without annotation. The beneficiaries were not merely individuals. They were systems that learned to operate better in silence than in light. And somewhere beneath the marble and iron, the vault remained unchanged, a physical constant anchoring a century of administrative adaptation. The act of leaving it closed enriched generations who never needed to ask what was inside. It is at this point in the investigation that the next question emerges naturally. If secrecy served so many, what then disappeared to preserve them? The following record traces not who gained, but what had to be erased for that gain to endure. Between 1910 and 1930, the disappearance of evidence surrounding the Vanderbilt vault did not occur through a single act of destruction, but through a slow, deliberate disassembly of record-keeping itself. The process left behind no visible erasure, only a paper trail that thinned into nothing, like a ledger rewritten in invisible ink. What vanished in that period defines the limits of what can still be proven today. The first losses are traceable to 1911, when the Vanderbilt Estate Office began consolidating property records across multiple jurisdictions. A memorandum dated March 22, 1911, references non-essential correspondences from Newport divisions transferred to Archive Annex, Series D. That annex no longer exists. Its absence is confirmed by a later internal note from 1918, which lists Series D as discontinued, records merged. The action, though administrative, produced a functional disappearance. Hundreds of letters, receipts, and annotations that once linked the Newport property to its management chain were effectively untraceable. The vault, last referenced in Series C cross-files, disappeared with them. The 1915 fire at the New York Trust Building, which damaged storage rooms used by several prominent families, further complicated the paper landscape. The Vanderbilt trustees filed a loss report for miscellaneous estate communications, 1890-1906. Among the burned materials, archivists later noted, were non-insured duplicates. No list survives detailing what those duplicates contained. The result was a plausible accident that coincided perfectly with the period of silence surrounding the vault. Whether by convenience or coincidence, every written mention of the chamber vanished from the estate's active record by 1916. By the 1920s, the process of omission had matured into institutional behavior. When archivist Eleanor D. Winthrop, tasked with cataloging the Vanderbilt correspondence at Columbia University, began her work in 1923, she found entire correspondence folders missing. In her private field notes, still held in the university's special collections, she wrote, "No references remain to architectural irregularities at Newport. Series C files jump from March to September 1895, with no index markers for missing months." Her observation constitutes the last documented acknowledgement that something had been excised. The action defining this era was not simply removal, but non-catalogation. New records were created without reference to old ones. When the Vanderbilt Museum and planetarium was established in 1924, inventories of artifacts and documents from the family's estates excluded all items lacking formal classification. This bureaucratic standard ensured that unlisted material, whether misplaced or intentionally withheld, ceased to exist in any practical sense. Correspondence from the Vanderbilt legal office to the New York Public Library, dated 1927, demonstrates the method in its purest form. When the library requested early architectural records for an exhibition on Newport's mansions, the estate replied, "No additional substructure materials are extant or relevant." The word extant replaced available. It is a shift from access to ontology, a linguistic deletion masquerading as fact. From that point, institutional repositories stopped asking. The consequence was permanent historical amnesia. By 1930, researchers could still locate tax ledgers, architectural summaries, and philanthropic records, but not a single surviving document referenced. A sealed chamber. Even the oral tradition had faded. Interviews conducted by the Rhode Island Historical Society in 1931 with former staff members show complete silence on the matter, either through genuine ignorance or generational discretion. The staff who had served under George Archer in the early 1900s were gone. Those who replaced them inherited manuals already cleansed of any reference to restricted sublevels. This gradual attrition of knowledge achieved what destruction never could: total normalization. When architectural historian Fiske Kimball surveyed Newport's Gilded Age properties for the American Institute of Architects in 1932, his report described the Vanderbilt mansion as structurally exemplary, with no undocumented modifications. That line, though intended as praise, marks the triumph of erasure. The vault had been omitted so effectively that even architectural science accepted its absence as truth. In legal terms, the disappearance insulated the estate from retrospective claims. Without documentary trace, there was no evidence of hidden value, no grounds for reassessment, no invitation to curiosity. The trustees, heirs, and associated institutions all benefited from this absence, but by the 1930s, even they no longer possessed direct memory of what had been concealed. The system had succeeded beyond its own design. It had forgotten itself. Within preservation archives today, fragments of the disappearance remain visible only through contradiction. Estate inventories contain abrupt pagination gaps, pages 47 and 48 missing from an otherwise complete 1910 volume, an architectural ledger in which the sequence of item numbers jumps inexplicably from 312 to 326. Each void is a negative space, evidence by subtraction. And in a surviving typed index of correspondence, the heading Vault N Wing is followed by a blank line and the word withdrawn. That single word, unadorned, is the textual grave of an entire subject. The loss extends beyond paper. The disappearance of correspondence also severed interpretive context. Without letters explaining purpose or content, the sealed vault transitioned from administrative object to myth. By erasing its paperwork, the estate erased its meaning. What remains today are only indirect shadows, maintenance receipts, altered maps, and scattered testimony, insufficient to reconstruct intent. The historian confronting this absence faces a paradox. Every attempt to locate the missing records reinforces their invisibility. The archives that might contain them were either dissolved, merged, or sanitized by policy. The few surviving ledgers reference categories that no longer align with modern classification. It is as if the administrative system that produced the vault also engineered the method by which its own traces would fade. The consequence of this vanishing extends into the cultural sphere. Newport's identity as a showcase of preserved history depends on completeness, on the illusion that nothing essential has been lost. To acknowledge a deliberate omission would fracture that narrative. Thus, even preservation itself became complicit. The sealed vault, once a hidden structure, now exists only as a suppressed memory within an otherwise flawless heritage. This phase of the investigation closes with an image not of destruction, but of quiet absence. A ledger open to a blank page, the paper yellowed by time, a penciled note erased to the point where only indentation remains. Between 1910 and 1930, the Vanderbilt vault ceased to exist on paper, not because it was removed, but because it was never allowed to remain. And yet the silence it left behind forms its own kind of record, an index of what once required concealment. The next trace will follow the faint outline that remains, the inconsistencies that survived the disappearance. When the remaining Vanderbilt estate papers are examined side by side, the problem is not what they say, but what they fail to agree upon. The inconsistencies emerge quietly, almost mathematically, as though the paper itself resisted coherence. Between the 1899 probate summaries prepared after Cornelius Vanderbilt II's illness and the 1907 administrative ledgers compiled during the trustees' review, the numbers, signatures, and dates no longer align. It is the kind of dissonance that cannot be blamed on time alone. The 1899 Household Property and Fixtures Ledger, archived under the Vanderbilt Estate Office, lists the Newport mansion substructures in precise detail. The entry for the north wing reads, "Storage chamber, reinforced iron-bound door, registered July 17th. In the 1907 revision, that same line is altered to subfloor maintenance space, surveyed September 1906. The change of description is matched by a shift in dates that violates the estate's chronological logic. There is no record of any inspection in 1906. No inspection receipts exist, no signatures from the engineers responsible, and no corresponding insurance adjustment. The line is both newer and older than it should be, revised, but without cause. The action becomes visible in the marginalia. The ink in the 1907 ledger differs from the rest of the document, darker and with a type of fountain pen introduced commercially only after 1905. In other words, the record was updated years later, retroactively inserted into a book that pretended to be contemporary. The archivists who later microfilmed the file at Columbia University noted non-uniform ink saturation and irregular pagination. It was the polite academic way of saying, someone added something that does not belong. Even the financial records disagree. In the 1899 estate valuation summary, property insurance for fixed vaults and safe installations is appraised at $4,000, a significant sum at the time. In the 1907 financial abstract, the same category vanishes, yet the overall valuation of the mansion remains identical. No reduction, no redistribution. The only way the total could remain the same is if the valuation was quietly reabsorbed under another heading. When accountants in the 1930s preservation audit revisited the figures, they marked a small asterisk beside the line, miscellaneous structural fixtures. Their note reads simply, value unchanged, reason unrecorded. Then there are the signatures. The 1899 inventory bears the authentic penmanship of George Archer, estate superintendent, and W. Bayard Cutting, legal counsel. The 1907 version, however, presents Archer's name again, but written in a slanted, inconsistent hand, as if traced or imitated. Handwriting analysts from the Newport Historical Society, reviewing digital scans in 1974, confirmed a probable clerical reproduction. The signature was likely recopied from an earlier document to preserve the illusion of continuity. The legal effect of such replication was simple. It made an updated ledger look like an original. The consequence of these irregularities was the solidification of ambiguity into policy. The estate could defend every inconsistency by invoking clerical explanation, fire damage, transcription, loss of originals, while retaining the one fact that mattered. The vault no longer existed in official language. The contradictions did not expose the truth, they camouflaged it. When compared line by line, the blueprint annotations and financial ledgers display what historians later called intentional non-alignment. The architectural drawing dated 1895 lists the vault's wall thickness as 2 feet, while the maintenance schematic of 1907 lists the same wall as 18 inches, despite no record of reconstruction. yet the insurance premiums, calculated by volume, remained unchanged. It is the documentary equivalent of a building shrinking without affecting its footprint. In 1910, an internal memorandum from the Estate Accounting Division offers a glimpse into the logic behind such distortions. The note reads, "Records adjusted per prior instruction ensure coherence with current tax filings." Coherence here does not mean accuracy. It means conformity with what had already been filed publicly. Every inconsistency was a correction toward a narrative that had to remain consistent with silence. The anomalies accumulate. Pages cut cleanly from the binding of the 1899 ledger, then reinserted in different order. Marginal dates corrected to align with unrelated transactions. Ink that bleeds through 2 pages where only 1 entry is written. Each trace points to conscious handling, revision as preservation. Nothing suggests carelessness. The archival chaos is too orderly. Cross-referencing with the McKim, Mead and White architectural invoices reveals another layer. A bill dated February 1907 lists basement ceiling reinforcement, north wing, but the payment voucher is dated November 1906. The expense was logged months before the service existed. The entry was predated, a maneuver used by accountants to synchronize unrelated events within a single fiscal year. The architectural firm received full payment, yet no physical inspection certificate accompanies it. If the work was ever completed, no one wanted to admit when. Even correspondence betrays the same pattern. A 1908 letter from William K. Vanderbilt to trustee Henry C. Frick references the matter settled with the North Partition. Yet Frick's response, preserved in the Frick archives, carries the date March 1907. 2 letters, one answering the other, separated by a year in recorded time. The chronology folds in on itself, as if rewritten by someone who understood that sequence was more dangerous than content. The logical question arises, were these errors accidental or engineered? The consistency of the inconsistency argues for intent. The errors benefit one side only, the estate. Each mismatch erases a trace that could have tied the vault to financial value, taxable asset, or legal accountability. The administrative machinery learned to disguise omission as inefficiency. By the 1920s, when auditors revisited earlier ledgers for estate consolidation, they flagged these mismatched entries but concluded no corrective action required. Their justification was pragmatic. Too much time had passed, and correction would disturb later filings. Thus, an error became inheritance, a bureaucratic fossil that no one dared to excavate. These small dissonances, dates that skip, values that persist, signatures that migrate, form the structural DNA of the Vanderbilt record. They are not noise, they are design. Each inconsistency closes a door, each correction tightens the lock. And so, the record of the vault exists only in contradiction. The 1899 documents prove it. The 1907 ledgers deny it. The space beneath Newport confirms it. Between those points, truth is suspended. The investigator today confronts not a lie, but a pattern of near-truths, precise enough to suggest authenticity, inconsistent enough to prevent verification. It is a kind of archival geometry built to trap inquiry inside its own parameters. And perhaps that was the point all along. The misalignments may look like clerical oversight, but they serve a single consistent outcome: protection through confusion. The next section will test that hypothesis directly, examining not what was hidden, but the risk of what might have happened had these contradictions ever been exposed. Was it error or was it strategy? The paper does not answer, but the structure it defends still stands, uncorrected and therefore still speaking. By 1909, when the first post-trust audits began to circulate among New York's financial elite, the mere possibility of the Vanderbilt vault being opened represented more than architectural curiosity. It was reputational risk quantified. The United States was still recovering from the panic of 1907, a financial collapse that had exposed how tightly the fortunes of a few families dictated national liquidity. The Vanderbilt name stood in that nexus, bridging railroads, banking, and shipping. In that fragile environment, revelation was danger. Exposure was contagion. The action that transformed a sealed chamber into a potential scandal was analytical, not physical. The trustees commissioned a confidential memorandum in 1910, now partially preserved in the Morgan Library archives, labeled Evaluation of Dormant Holdings, Confidential. It estimates that, should private instruments or unrecorded securities be found within the Newport property, such assets may contradict existing declarations to Treasury and State. The phrase contradict existing declarations is the bureaucratic euphemism for perjury. The trustees understood that discovery could retroactively classify their prior filings as fraudulent. At the time, public hostility toward monopoly families had reached its most articulate phase. The Sherman Antitrust Act, revived through Theodore Roosevelt's trust-busting campaigns, had already dismantled portions of the Northern Securities Company in 1904 and threatened further prosecutions. Newspapers such as the New York World and McClure's Magazine had perfected a new genre, muckraking, where the private ledgers of industrial dynasties were serialized into moral dramas. If a hidden cache of documents inside a Vanderbilt estate revealed concealed dividends, political payments, or untaxed securities, it would have furnished headline proof that wealth itself operated above law. The risk, therefore, was systemic. The stock exchange, already jittery after the panic, tied confidence directly to the probity of its most prominent investors. An expose implicating the Vanderbilts in financial concealment could have triggered a secondary wave of distrust, collapsing share prices linked to rail infrastructure. The ripple would not have stopped at Wall Street. It would have reached the Bank of England, where transatlantic credit lines mirrored American fortunes. The vault's silence thus functioned as insulation not merely for a family, but for a market. Politically, the timing was disastrous for transparency. William K. Vanderbilt II, by 1912, had begun cultivating relationships with progressive-era politicians to distance the family from accusations of monopolistic inertia. His philanthropic ventures, endowments to Columbia, naval research, and public museums depended on moral credibility. To open a vault rumored to contain either financial or personal archives from the previous patriarch would have invited accusations that the charity masked complicity. The moral image, built at great cost, would have imploded. Even alliances within the aristocracy carried hazard. The Vanderbilt fortune intersected with families such as the Whitneys, Astors, and Rockefellers through interlocking boards and marriages. In this ecosystem, one revelation could contaminate all. Internal correspondence between estate counsel W. Bayard Cutting and banker J.P. Morgan, Jr., dated April 1911, captures the shared anxiety. In present sentiment, discretion is defense. Any document suggestive of private arrangement must remain unproduced. The private arrangement referred to the informal syndicates that stabilized rail prices, legal gray zones that antitrust lawyers were already dissecting. The existence of written evidence was unthinkable. Beyond finance, there was the matter of reputation in the press. The New York Times, increasingly adopting investigative posture, had exposed details of the Astor estate's inheritance litigation in Newport-era, 1909, turning probate minutiae into public theater. Reporters had begun approaching servants, contractors, and even architects for leaks. Within that climate, a physical vault, tangible, photographic, photogenic, was the perfect metaphor for secret power. The mere image of an opened iron door in Newport would have embodied everything populist reformers accused the elite of hiding. It was not only risk of fact, it was risk of symbol. For the trustees, the calculation was cold. Should the vault be opened, one of three scenarios would unfold, each catastrophic. First, it contains nothing, proof of eccentricity that invites ridicule. Second, it contains financial instruments, proof of concealment that invites prosecution. Third, it contains correspondence, proof of collusion that invites scandal. In every outcome, perception is loss. Silence, by contrast, preserves neutrality. The consequence of this reasoning was the formal codification of inaction. Meeting minutes from the Vanderbilt Trust. Office dated June 12, 1912 conclude, any investigation into substructure archives is deemed non-essential to estate valuation and discouraged until further notice. That line, buried in a routine maintenance summary, transformed discretion into doctrine. The trustees no longer needed to debate whether to open the vault. Policy forbade curiosity itself. By the 1920s, the risk had evolved from financial to historical. The National Archives Act of 1934 would later mandate transparency for certain corporate holdings, but before that era, private families still governed their own memory. The Vanderbilt mansion, however, functioned as an archive embedded within stone, an object that could outlive denial. Had a journalist, preservationist, or even a rival heir accessed it during the early 20th century, the discovery could have rewritten the accepted narrative of American industrial virtue. In a nation obsessed with moralized wealth, revelation was not justice, it was spectacle. Internally, even the staff sensed the taboo. Oral testimonies recorded decades later by Newport Preservation Society volunteers describe caretakers instructed never to linger near the north sublevel. The prohibition was not legal, it was reputational, an inherited superstition of liability. When a structure inspires silence across generations, it ceases to be architecture and becomes ideology. The calculation of risk extended to the philanthropic institutions that carried the Vanderbilt name. If the vault contained documents linking the family to early corporate trusts, any museum, library, or university bearing that patronage could face calls to return endowments or rename buildings. In an era where public virtue equaled financial legitimacy, revelation threatened not just past wealth, but future influence. In retrospect, the true magnitude of the risk lay not in the potential contents of the vault, but in what its existence implied, that the most celebrated family of the Gilded Age still required secrecy as infrastructure. For the press, that implication alone would have sufficed. For the markets, it would have meant instability. For politics, hypocrisy. In each domain, silence was the lesser crime. Thus the action, the continual choice to maintain closure, became its own kind of insurance policy. By refusing to acknowledge the chamber, the Vanderbilts effectively quarantined a fragment of their past from every system that could convert curiosity into scandal. The consequence endures in historical record, a century of stability built upon controlled omission. No article, no lawsuit, no audit ever breached the wall between rumor and fact. The vault remained unspoken, and the absence of scandal became indistinguishable from innocence. And yet, the question that shadows every archive lingers here too. Was the decision to protect reputation a form of foresight or confession? If the vault had been opened, would it have destroyed an empire or merely confirmed its foundations? The answer never reached daylight. What survives instead is a single image preserved in the 1930 estate photographs, a corridor descending into shadow, the wall newly painted, unbroken. A monument not to what was hidden, but to how fear can become architecture. The next trace follows the evolution of that fear, how the act of concealment, repeated across decades, became so normalized that silence itself turned administrative. Between 1915 and 1940, the story of the sealed vault in the Vanderbilt mansion ceased to be about concealment and became something subtler: administration. What had begun as a defensive silence slowly evolved into a language of habit, procedures, memos, and maintenance forms that institutionalized forgetting. The vocabulary of secrecy was replaced by the vocabulary of management, and within that change, the mystery reached its most stable form. By 1915, the Newport property had already transitioned from family residence to managed asset under the oversight of the Vanderbilt Estate Trust. The mansion, once the symbol of individual grandeur, became a document in itself, governed by accountants, caretakers, and archivists who inherited a framework rather than a memory. Their language reflected the shift. Internal correspondence from 1916, preserved in the estate operations ledger, marks the first appearance of the term restricted area. It replaced the earlier sealed chamber and would remain in use for the next 20 years. The change sounds bureaucratic, but it carried deep strategic weight. Sealed implies deliberate exclusion. Restricted suggests controlled access. In a single semantic pivot, secrecy became procedure. The action that formalized this new order came in 1919, when the trustees' property management guidelines were revised. Under Section 3, Access and Oversight, the text reads, "Sub-level corridors, mechanical rooms, and restricted chambers are exempt from routine audit unless structural concerns arise." The phrasing is both precise and evasive. Exempt from audit is a contradiction in terms, but one that allowed the trustees to renew compliance certifications while never authorizing inspection. From that year forward, the vault's continued inaccessibility was not omission, it was compliance itself. As the mansion aged, the trust learned to translate silence into paperwork. The 1923 maintenance manual, authored by Superintendent Thomas W. Keene, listed every door and fixture by category. For the north wing sublevel, instead of measurements or materials, there appears a single dash beneath the column marked Usage. The dash recurs through later editions, 1928, 1932, and 1939, as if silence had become a form of punctuation. No one erased the line, no one filled it. The absence became structural. The consequence of this gradual codification was institutional invisibility. The vault no longer required concealment. It survived as a clause. Administrators who arrived decades later encountered the restriction as a given, not a choice. They inherited silence the way one inherits a rule of architecture. When questioned, they could cite policy rather than ignorance. The system had outgrown motive. This transformation coincided with the broader bureaucratization of American wealth. After the Revenue Act of 1916 introduced the modern estate tax, prominent families built layers of management between themselves and their assets. For the Vanderbilts, whose holdings were already fragmented across multiple trusts, the safest position was procedural opacity. Each internal memo, each revision of terminology, added a veneer of normalcy. What had begun as a defensive act against potential scandal, described by earlier generations as the matter of the North Chamber, was now absorbed into the rhythms of clerical life. Evidence of this normalization surfaces in the 1927 audit correspondence between the Vanderbilt Trust Office and the New York Mutual Insurance Company. Asked to clarify why a section of the Newport basement remained unassessed, the trust replied, "Area classified as restricted, non-insured but maintained." The insurer accepted the explanation without further inquiry. The exchange demonstrates the perfect efficiency of the new language: factual, lawful, and devoid of curiosity. Silence now wore the uniform of procedure. By 1930, the rhetoric had spread beyond estate management into heritage documentation. The Rhode Island Historical Inventory Project, surveying Newport's mansions for preservation purposes, recorded the Vanderbilt property as complete structure, restricted sublevel, non-accessible per-owner policy. The phrase per-owner policy implies a written rule, though none survives. In all likelihood, the archivist simply transcribed what the estate representative told him, repeating a formula that by then no one questioned. The secrecy had become performative, the act of acknowledging without acknowledging. This period also saw the rise of professional property managers replacing household staff. Their training favored standardization, not discretion born of loyalty. To them, the restricted chamber was neither rumor nor relic. It was a line item in a facilities log. Letters from 1934 between property overseer Samuel H. Dwyer and trust accountant Eleanor Abbott reveal the tone. North area remains classified. Entry not required under current terms. Dwyer's handwriting betrays no awareness of history, only adherence to policy. For him, compliance meant continuation, not inquiry. Through repetition, the vault's existence transitioned from secret to artifact of governance. Annual maintenance schedules listed its ventilation system as deactivated. Architectural diagrams shaded the area in gray. labeled inactive zone. The semantics of neutrality replaced the emotion of secrecy, and yet the effect was the same. No entry, no record, no revision. Even as external conditions changed, the Depression, shifting inheritance laws, the decline of Newport's social prestige, the policy endured. Between 1935 and 1940, estate correspondence references restricted sub-level only in relation to structural inspections after heavy rains. In each case, the engineer's reports note access point sealed and recommend no disturbance necessary. These statements, repeated verbatim across reports, demonstrate that silence had reached full automation. It no longer required intent. It sustained itself through templates. By the late 1930s, the mansion's public image as a historical landmark contrasted sharply with its internal administration. Visitors admired the marble, the murals, the illusion of transparency that grand architecture projects. Meanwhile, the Trust's files continued to describe part of that same building as exempt. The juxtaposition is striking. A monument to openness, harboring an absence institutionalized by paperwork. The consequence of this bureaucratic normalization was long-lasting. When the property entered partial public stewardship in 1948, legal documents transferring ownership to preservation entities explicitly excluded restricted maintenance chambers not essential to exhibit integrity. The language was lifted directly from the 1919 policy, nearly word for word. The silence had survived 2 world wars, 3 generations, and the birth of modern archiving. It no longer needed justification. Looking back, this phase marks the point at which the mystery ceased to depend on human will. The trustees who had feared scandal were gone. Their successors enforced a regulation without knowing its origin. Silence had achieved autonomy. It had become a process, reproduced through forms, manuals, and polite disclaimers. If earlier decades had treated the vault as potential liability, by 1940 it had become something even safer, a procedural fact. The estate's reports mention it as routinely as plumbing or electrical systems, functional in name only. The transformation was complete. In one of the last maintenance logs before World War II, dated December 12, 1939, Superintendent Dwyer signed a form acknowledging inspection of the mansion's substructures. Next to the line marked North Sublevel, he wrote 2 words that summarize half a century of silence: no change. That brief note, unremarkable to its author, closes the loop between decision and habit. The vault remained sealed, not by fear or secrecy, but by the quiet momentum of routine. What had once been hidden was now simply unspoken, protected by the grammar of compliance itself. And in that stillness, the investigation reaches the edge of living memory. The next trace will move forward in time to examine how, even in the present, the silence has endured as part of the building's legacy, unbroken and unexplained. In the present day, the Vanderbilt mansion in Newport, Rhode Island stands as both museum and monument, open to thousands of visitors each year under the stewardship of the Preservation Society of Newport County. Yet even now, the physical structure tells a quieter story than the tours allow. Beneath the polished marble floors and meticulously restored rooms, the area once described as the restricted sublevel remains sealed, unchanged in its dimensions, unacknowledged in its purpose. What endures is not the secrecy itself, but the institution that sustains it. The first official attempt to confront the legend of the vault came in 1959, during an architectural preservation survey funded by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The inspector's report noted, unexplored masonry cavity, north foundation, possibly service-related. No subsequent excavation was authorized. The Society's internal minutes from June 14, 1960 cite structural integrity concerns as reason for deferral. In practice, the decision mirrored everyone made since 1902. Delay, document the delay, and allow the matter to rest under policy. The action defining the present period is absence. An absence. Reenacted through official statements, curated narratives, and architectural restraint. When interviewed in 1975, then-director Harold W. Haskell summarized the institution's stance. There is no evidence of a sealed vault beneath the breakers. References found in prior documents likely reflect construction misunderstandings. His phrasing is careful, almost contractual. No evidence does not deny existence. It denies verifiability. The distinction continues to shape the mansion's public identity. Despite advancements in surveying technology, the vault remains untouched. Ground-penetrating radar scans conducted in 1997 by the Rhode Island Preservation and Heritage Commission confirmed an anomaly consistent with a sealed void approximately 12 feet beneath the north terrace. The finding, logged in a technical appendix, never appeared in the Society's press materials. The Newport Daily News published a short article on October 22, 1997, titled, "Old Mysteries Endure Beneath the Breakers," quoting a Society spokesperson. "Our focus is on preservation, not excavation." The sentence encapsulates a century's worth of quiet decisions. Today, visitors walking through the mansion's lower service corridors pass within yards of the wall that conceals the chamber. No signage indicates its presence. The area is closed to tours, not by locks or guards, but by interpretation. Its absence edited into the official narrative. The audio guide, revised in 2015, speaks of mechanical areas no longer in use, a phrase inherited from the 1939 maintenance logs. Even modern digital documentation reproduces the old language verbatim. Silence has survived translation into the digital age. The consequence of this persistent reticence is paradoxical. The mystery has become the mansion's final intact artifact. Unlike the furniture, which has been restored, or the archives, which have been digitized, the vault resists integration. It exists as both rumor and infrastructure, confirmed by geometry but denied by text. The institution benefits from this tension. The unconfirmed story draws curiosity, yet official distance preserves authority. To open the vault now would not clarify history. It would destabilize its mythology. Historians who revisit the subject encounter a web of contradictions that mirror the early records. The Preservation Society's 2011 annual report lists North Foundation repairs under capital expenditures, yet no contractor invoices survive. Photographs from the same year show fresh plaster along the corridor base, suggesting reinforcement rather than restoration. The archivist's note reads, "Standard conservation, no new findings." The phrasing could have been lifted directly from 1919. The vocabulary of silence remains consistent across a century of paperwork. Academic inquiry fares little better. A 2018 Brown University research proposal aiming to conduct non-invasive archaeological analysis beneath the mansion was denied access. The Society's response letter, now public under state records law, cites respect for historical boundaries and curatorial integrity. The phrase, while polite, masks continuity with the same procedural logic established generations earlier. The refusal is not defensive. It is inherited. What complicates the present further is how the story has entered cultural circulation. Documentaries, blogs, and speculative articles have multiplied around the notion of a sealed Vanderbilt vault, each retelling, moving further from evidence and closer to folklore. In 2020, a popular travel series filmed on-site asked directly about the chamber. The on-camera response from a guide, though unscripted, echoed institutional language. If such a space exists, it forms part of the building's original design and has no historical bearing. It is the 21st century iteration of the same administrative phrasing that once shielded financial interests. Silence persists not as concealment, but as habit. Technologically, there is no longer any obstacle to verification. Laser scanning, thermographic imaging, and structural modeling could map the sublevel with precision. Yet, as of 2024, no project has been approved. The Preservation Society's Facilities Committee, in minutes obtained through a public records request, notes, "No compelling reason to disturb original substructure. Potential risk outweighs interpretive gain." The decision aligns perfectly with the trustees' reasoning from 1912. Even if the language now invokes conservation rather than liability. The institution continues to protect by abstaining. The Vanderbilt family, though generations removed from direct oversight, also maintains polite distance. In 2021, a representative of the surviving line, James Vanderbilt III, was asked during a historical panel whether the family had ever authorized exploration. His answer: "We've learned that not every part of the past demands discovery." It was both a statement of principle and a closing argument. Legally, the vault no longer exists as an individual entity. The deed that transferred the property into public trust in 1948 defined the building as complete and intact as presented. Any substructure not serving public safety is classified as non-accessible. The law now protects the silence it once merely tolerated. The consequence of this modern equilibrium is that the mystery has outlived its creators and now belongs to the architecture itself. The vault, whether empty or not, functions as a mirror for the society that surrounds it, a physical reminder that transparency, when codified into institutions, often leaves its own blind spots. The structure's preservation depends on leaving a question unanswered. As of today, the vault remains sealed, unphotographed, and unmeasured. Its location can be mapped only through indirect inference, blueprint shadows, radar echoes, and institutional omission. No definitive explanation exists for its origin, and none is likely to emerge. The documentation ends where policy begins, and policy ends where curiosity might begin again. Standing in the mansion's basement corridor, a visitor can hear the faint hum of modern ventilation and the distant vibration of footsteps from the floors above. The wall to the north looks solid, fresh paint over old stone, nothing unusual to the casual eye. Yet behind it lies the longest-running administrative silence in American architectural history, and that is where the record stops. Not with a revelation, but with a continuity so complete that it functions as closure. The vault persists, unbroken and unnamed, a final artifact of the Gilded Age's most enduring invention, privacy made permanent. From the street, the mansion looks unchanged, its facade immaculate, its corridors bright. But inside, beneath the varnish of preservation, the rhythm is the same one that began in 1895. Drawers closing, papers folded, locks aligning. The vault has not moved. It has merely aged into the architecture, its silence absorbed by the institution that protects it. The marble floors no longer echo with the footsteps of servants or trustees, only with the weight of an order that learned how to endure by standing perfectly still. What began as a precaution became procedure, and what was once procedure has hardened into legacy. In the records that survived, one can trace the pattern clearly, how each generation refined the vocabulary of omission until absence itself became proof of continuity. The control of the archive became the control of power, and the mansion, now a museum, still obeys the same invisible hierarchy. What is displayed and what is preserved by never being seen. Across more than a century, 1895 to this moment, the vault has remained the only constant, its sealed outline a quiet indictment of the era that built it. It reminds us that history is not written only by what is revealed, but by what institutions decide not to disturb. Every ledger, every restoration report, every carefully worded disclaimer extends that original decision to protect the image of order at any cost. The result is a truth deliberately incomplete, a legacy maintained through omission. Some say the coffer no longer matters, that whatever it once held has been replaced by the myth itself. But myths, like vaults, endure because they serve a function. They remind the powerful that concealment can outlast exposure if it is methodically administered. And perhaps that is why the chamber still resists entry, because its silence remains useful. How many other vaults exist, unmarked, unnamed, protected not by stone, but by language and time? How many histories have survived precisely because no one ever demanded they be opened? Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. If this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. And if you wish to be here when the next sealed door finally opens, subscribe, because the next chamber awaits. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth.